Welcome to the 5th episode of our podcast, Couple of Lawyers, Arguments and Thought. We're going to be talking about something that affects every single one of you, whether you're like a total tech whiz or just, starting to figure out this whole internet thing.
Yeah.
It's India's brand new data protection law.
Yes.
The Digital Personal Data Protection Act.
Right.
Or DPDP for short.
Exactly.
And you know what's really cool? The law uses she to refer to individuals.
I know. It's amazing.
It's a huge step forward for inclusivity in Indian legislation.
It's definitely groundbreaking, yeah.
So before we get into all the details,
Sure.
can you remind us why we even needed a new law in the first place?
Well, think about it. Back in 2000, we had the Information Technology Act, the IT Act. But the world has changed so much since then.
It really has.
I mean, back then, e-commerce was just starting. Social media, it wasn't really a thing yet.
Yeah.
Smartphones, nobody had those.
It's true. It's a totally different universe now.
Exactly. And the IT Act, it was good for its time,
Yeah.
but it just wasn't built to handle what we have today,
Yeah, I see that.
Today's data-driven world is so complex. The old law focused on data security, but it didn't really get into privacy rights. It didn't really talk about consent or what happens if companies misuse data.
So all those scary things we hear about,
Exactly.
data breaches and online scams and identity theft and all that,
Yeah.
the DPDP Act is trying to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. It steps in with a much stronger framework. It's all about protecting your personal information,
Okay.
giving you more control over your data, and holding companies accountable.
So it's like data protection 2.0,
Yeah, you could say that.
a much needed upgrade.
Definitely.
So, okay, DPDP versus the old IT Act. What are the biggest differences?
So the DPDP Act is way more comprehensive. There's a really strong emphasis on user rights, like we talked about. It has crystal clear consent requirements and much stricter penalties for companies that don't follow the rules.
Oh, interesting.
It's about creating a more transparent system for data processing in India, a more responsible ecosystem.
That makes sense. Now, how does all of this compare to those big international data protection laws,
Right.
like GDPR in Europe or the privacy laws in the U.S.?
Oh, that's a great question. There are definitely some similarities and some differences. So both the DPDP Act and GDPR, they both put the power in the hands of the user. They emphasize consent and data subject rights, They both lay out roles like the data fiduciary, which is basically the company that collects your data,
Okay,
and the data protection officer who makes sure the company is following all the rules.
got it. So what's different?
Well, GDPR, it has a global reach. Any company handling data that belongs to EU citizens has to follow it, no matter where that company is actually based. The DPDP Act, on the other hand, it focuses on protecting Indian data subjects.
Okay, I see. So if a company is in, say, the U.S.,
Okay.
but they're targeting Indian customers, they would still have to follow the DPDP Act.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
Now, the U.S. is a little different. Their privacy laws are kind of fragmented,
Okay.
They have laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which is strong on consent and transparency, but it only applies in California.
Right.
The DPDP Act, like GDPR, it aims for one central framework for all of India.
Got it. So it's a big step towards, putting India on the map when it comes to data protection. But there's one thing I'm not quite clear on. I know the DPDP Acts came out last year, but it seems like things are still, kind of in flux.
Yeah, you've hit on a crucial point. We have the act itself, but the detailed rules for how it will be implemented are still being worked out.
I see.
So the act gives us the big picture, but companies are kind of waiting to see how the specific rules will affect them,
So it's a law in waiting.
Exactly. And that's causing a lot of anticipation in the business world and honestly some anxiety too,
I bet.
Everyone's waiting to see how these rules are going to shake things up.
Makes sense. So while we wait for all the final pieces to come together, let's talk about what we know about the DPDP Act. For starters, what exactly is considered digital data under this new law?
It's a good question, and it's actually broader than you might think. The DPDP Act doesn't just cover data collected online. It also includes data that was collected offline, say, on a paper form, but then later digitized.
Oh, okay. So even those loyalty program sign-up sheets you see at the mall, if they end up in a computer system, that would fall under the DPDP Act.
Exactly. And another important point. The DPDP Act covers data generated within India, of course, but it also covers data processed outside of India if it's being used to offer goods or services to Indian citizens.
So even if a company is operating from, let's say, the UK, but they're targeting Indian customers, they still need to follow the DPDP Act.
That's the idea. The goal is to provide strong protection for Indian data subjects, regardless of where their data is actually processed.
This is really giving us a sense of just how broad this whole law is. Now, there's this term, significant data fiduciary, or SDF. It's been in the news a lot. What exactly is that about?
Oh, yeah. The SDF, it's a new category under the DPDP. And yeah, it's definitely causing a bit of a stir. So basically, the government will decide which companies are SDFs. And it's based on a few things: how much data they handle, how sensitive that data is, and the potential risks involved.
Yeah, so if I have like a little online shop, just a few hundred customers, I probably don't need to worry about becoming an SDF.
Probably not, no.
But a giant company like, say, Facebook, with tons of users in India,
Right.
they'd probably be classified as an SDF.
Exactly. They would have to follow some additional rules.
Oh, I see. What kind of rules? What makes them different?
Well, one big one is they need to appoint a data protection officer, a DPO.
Yeah.
And this person has to be based right here in India. They're basically in charge of making sure the company is following all the DPDP rules.
Like their data protection guru?
Exactly. They also need to hire an independent auditor, someone to check their compliance,
To make sure they're doing everything right.
Right. And they also have to do a data protection impact assessment.
A data protection impact assessment.
Well, yeah, it's a way of assessing risk, really. They look at all their data processing activities and try to identify any potential problem.
Before they even happen.
Exactly. It's all about being proactive.
So it's kind of like a privacy checkup.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's about making sure they have strong systems in place so they can actually protect your data.
That's good. So let's talk about consent, because it seems like consent is at the heart of this whole DPDP Act. It's about giving people more control over their own data.
Yes, absolutely. For a long time, it felt like companies were just taking our data without even asking.
Yeah, it did feel that way.
Or they'd bury the consent part in pages and pages of legal mumbo-jumbo.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that so many times.
But the DPDP Act changes that. It makes it very clear. You have to have informed consent to process someone's data. Okay? And that consent can't be some vague thing hidden in a huge terms of service document. It's to be clear, easy to understand, and you can withdraw it whenever you want.
So no more sneaky tactics.
No more sneaky tactics, no more confusing language.
That's good to hear.
It's all about giving you the power to make informed choices about your data.
I like that.
And to help you manage all of this, the Act has a new concept: the consent manager.
A consent manager, what's that?
It's a service that helps you keep track of all the permissions you've given out to different websites and platforms.
Oh, that's a good idea.
You can see who has access to what they're doing with your data, and you can change those permissions anytime.
All in one place.
Exactly.
That sounds really helpful, especially these days.
It is.
We're constantly giving out our data to everyone.
Yeah, it's a much-needed tool.
So it's like we're entering a whole new world of data protection with all these new rules and regulations.
Yeah, it is.
And with this new world, we have a bunch of new characters, the key players in this whole DPDP drama. Let's do a quick roll call.
Okay, so we have the data fiduciary, which is usually the company using your data. And then, of course, there's you, the data principal, the person the data belongs to.
Right, and that's where the she comes in, right? The DPDP uses she to refer to the data principal throughout the entire act. It might seem like a small change, but it's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. It's a challenge to all those gender biases we see in tech.
I love that. Okay, so who else do we have?
We have the data processor. This could be another company that's handling your data for the data fiduciary. They're usually the ones doing the processing, the storing, all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
So if I'm ordering food online, the restaurant is the data fiduciary, and the delivery app is the data processor.
Perfect example.
Got it.
And lastly, we have the data protection officer, the DPO. We talked about them earlier. They're like the data police, making sure everyone is following the rules.
Protecting our privacy. Okay, so we've got the players. Now, what exactly counts as personal data under the DPDP? And what happens if there's a data breach?
Good questions. So personal data is any information that can be used to identify you. Your name, your address, your online activities, financial information, all of that. And a personal data breach is when that information is accessed or disclosed without permission.
So it doesn't have to be hackers stealing data. It could be a company just accidentally leaking customer information.
Exactly. Any situation where your data is at risk, that's when those penalties we talked about earlier come into play.
The DPDP is serious about making companies protect our data.
Very serious.
It sounds like the penalties have some teeth. But okay, let's talk about us, the individuals. What can we do under this new law? What rights does it give us?
Well, the DPDP Act gives you a whole set of rights. The right to information, the right to correction and erasure, the right to grievance redressal, and the right to nominate.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. What's the right to information all about?
It basically means you have the right to know what's happening with your data.
Great.
How is it being used? Why is it being used? You can ask a company what information they have about you, what they're doing with it, who they're sharing it with.
So it's all about transparency.
Exactly. You have the right to know.
I like that. What about the right to correction and erasure? Does that mean I could just delete all my data from the internet?
Well, sort of. You have the right to have your data corrected if it's inaccurate.
Okay.
And if a company is holding on to data that they don't need anymore, you can ask them to delete it.
So I can hit the delete button on some of my digital footprint.
In some cases, yes.
That's good. What about grievance redressal?
So that means if you think a company is mishandling your data, you can file a complaint.
Okay, so there's a process for that.
Yes. The DPDP Act has a clear process for handling those kinds of complaints.
That's good to know. And finally, the right to nominate. What is that?
This one is interesting. It lets you choose someone to manage your data for you, especially if you're unable to do it yourself.
So if someone becomes incapacitated or passes away.
Exactly. Their nominated representative can step in and handle their data.
That makes sense. So these are all really great tools for individuals. It feels like the DPDP Act is really trying to give us more control over our data.
It is. It's a big shift in the power dynamic.
Now, what about the companies? The ones who don't follow these rules?
Right.
What happens to them?
Well, the DPDP Act has some serious penalties for companies that don't comply.
Oh, yeah.
The fines are pretty hefty, and that's on purpose.
So they know they need to take this seriously.
Exactly. It's a message that data privacy is important.
What kind of fines are we talking about here?
Okay, so if a company fails to prevent a data breach, meaning they didn't do enough to protect your data, they could be fined up to 250 crore.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is. And if they try to hide a data breach, like if they don't tell the affected people or the government, the fine can go up to 200 crore.
Okay, so there's no hiding.
No hiding.
And what about those significant data fiduciaries, the SDFs we talked about earlier?
Right. If they don't do what they're supposed to under the Act, they can also be fined up to 150 crore.
Wow, these penalties are no joke.
Nope.
It really shows that they're serious about enforcing this law.
They are. They want to make sure companies are protecting people's data.
It sounds like the DPDP Act is a big step forward for data protection in India.
It is. It's a huge step.
So while we wait for all the details to be finalized, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the main thing is to learn about your rights.
Okay.
The DPDP Act gives you a lot of power over your data, so take the time to understand how it works, read the Act, look up resources on data privacy, and stay informed.
Excellent advice. This law is a big deal. It's going to have a major impact on India's digital economy.
Definitely.
So stay informed, everyone. Until next time, stay safe in the digital world.